Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation Series. I am Ronald Spatz, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, and this event is being recorded and will be available on demand on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to non-commercial programming that showcases vibrant and diverse voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. Alaska Quarterly Review is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of Indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. Today, we are featuring the literary nonfiction writer Tom Kizzia. He's the author of 3 literary nonfiction books: Pilgrim's Wilderness, crowned 2013. Pilgrim's Wilderness was named a top 10 book of the year by Amazon and the best Alaska true crime book by the New York Times Book Review. Ken Burns called the book stunning and eloquent, and the Wall Street Journal called it extraordinary, the writing clear and unflinching. His first book, The Wake of the Unseen Object, Henry Holt, 1991, was recently reissued by the University of Alaska Press in its Classic Reprint series. Reviewing the original edition, the Philadelphia Inquirer called Kizzia a thoughtful and lyrical writer who manages to be sensitive without veering into sentimentality. And the Boston Globe added this: he writes with a quiet compassion that brings the people and their hard land clearly into focus. Of Kizzia's most recent book, Cold Mountain Path, Porphyry Press, 2021, former Alaska writer Laureate Heather Lende described the book this way: it's a story about the Alaska that we were once, and that now many of us feel we are losing. In addition to his book-length works, Kizzia's shorter works have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Nation, Los Angeles Times, The Washington Post, Columbia Journalism Review, and Best American Science and Nature Writing. Tom Kizzia, who lives in Homer, Alaska, was a longtime reporter at the Anchorage Daily News, and his work was also featured on CNN. In 2024, Kizzia received a career citation from the Alaska State Legislature, recognizing his contributions to Alaskan literature. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Tom Kizzia.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. And thanks to AQR for its support for this piece. It's a different kind of piece for me. This was a new venture. It's much more personal than my journalism has been. And it took me a long time to find the right tone for telling this. I've been kind of working on it off and on for years. It's a story of an essay about a trip I took to Europe with my kids when they were young. So thanks to AQR for launching me out of journalism and into whatever this is going to turn into. The piece is called Art History. The poppies along the track looked familiar. We had seen them at the museum, luminous daubs of reddish-orange pigment in meadows by the Seine, where Claude Monet went on afternoon outings with his wife and children, and where a commuter train from the Gare Saint-Lazare was now taking my own gallant little family. The humid rail car was half filled, mostly with tourists like us. My daughter, Emily, staring through glass at the Parisian sprawl, was fixed in some teenaged mid-Atlantic space by the music piping through white earbuds. Ethan, 4 years younger, sat beside her in a bright blue France jersey, his nose in an English football magazine. The World Cup was getting underway that long ago summer in Germany, and he was politely puzzled why, on his first trip abroad, he was taking a train to a painter's garden instead of to a football stadium. His blonde locks curled with sweat. Both kids, born and raised in a small cabin in Alaska, had suffered all week in the continental heat. We were hoping for relief when we reached the countryside, but so far had passed only miles of tile-roofed houses and shoebox apartments. Here and there, gray church spires rose above the suburbs like some protruding cultural bedrock. The car slowed at a station, my squinting efforts to summon a gauzy, impressionist landscape from the weeds, undone by brick walls of graffiti, and the faint breeze died. I folded my newspaper and fanned it to cool Ethan's face, because that's what Sally would have done. Sally was the one who had planned an overnight trip to Monet's home. She was the gardener in our family, the one who planted irises around the cabin and filled the rough-cut window boxes with pansies. She was also, as it happened, the parent schooled in Impressionism and the proper names of reddish-orange pigments. She used to joke that her art history degree had not been super practical for her professional work as an organizer for environmental causes in Alaska. But her love for the New World's wilderness had never erased a dream to visit Europe and to see the great works she studied at school. We often talked about leaving the cabin for a year abroad once our kids were old enough. Then one afternoon, Sally felt unwell and lay down on the couch and did not get up. It happened that fast. 4 days later, she was operated on for late-stage ovarian cancer. A rough few years followed, but then we had a run with a lucky chemo drug and the dream stirred again. Gone were energy and motivation for chasing down famous landmarks. She was annoyed by a travel book proposing 1,000 things to do before you die. The point is to be, not to do, she muttered, counting her days. Still, her one wish was time to watch her children grow into the world. Paris, prom, graduation. Round-trip tickets to France appeared under the Christmas tree. And to indulge my desire to plan something especially for her, Sally asked to visit the gardens at Giverny, where one of her favorite artists lived out his late years, successful and beloved, surrounded by family and a panorama of irises and dahlias, designed by his own painter's eye. A few months later, however, Sally emerged from the bedroom as I set dinner on the table to tell the kids that her cancer was back and the trip would have to be postponed. Ethan jumped down from his chair and ran to her. Emily, our young thespian, rose wordlessly and removed the flight itinerary from under its refrigerator magnet. And now we were in Paris without her. I was improvising, which I did a lot those first few years. Art projects with the kids had been one of Sally's jobs, like cutting our hair or sorting out our feelings. I marched them through the museums, determined to show them the world through their mother's eyes, but I'd hesitated to follow through with the overnight trip to Giverny. I told myself that a stroll through the famous gardens, so hallmark familiar from note cards and calendars, smacked of a pretty cliche, like the phrase, moving on with your life. Two things turned me around. One, I recalled words of the artist himself that I once taped to my computer terminal back when I worked in a newsroom. They were this: "For me, the subject is of secondary importance. I want to convey what is alive between me and the subject." Claude Monet. I'd been seeking inspiration not as a religious mystic, but as a young writer eager to squeeze more feeling from every story. I removed the quote only when another reporter pointed out it might make our editors uneasy, accurate rendition of the subject being of primary importance on the police beat. In the end, it was the discovery of a simple keepsake in a box of Sally's things that swept aside my condescension. The bookmark, distributed by a cancer advocacy group, was illustrated by one of Monet's most famous paintings, Woman with a Parasol. A young woman stands with a boy in a sunny field. She gazes down from the shade beneath her parasol, her face half obscured by tendrils of veil and light and sky. The caption said, "Camille Monet, the artist's first wife and mother of his two children, muse and model for so many of his early paintings, had died of ovarian cancer at age 32. The train started up and the air stirred again. In the old world, we'd learned 36 degrees meant miserable heat wave. Our hotel in the Latin Quarter had offered refuge in a shady garden filled with the first light fluting of birds. I rose alone the first morning and went to the courtyard for coffee. An elderly couple were crossing the cobbled driveway. She was frail, leaning on an off-balance walker, diaphanously dressed in a chalk-white wrap and a floppy sun hat that couldn't quite conceal the thin, patchy hair of a chemo patient. He shuffled behind in pressed jeans and a sports jacket, pushing an empty wheelchair propped with a fresh pillow. The sight made me glad we hadn't come to Paris when Sally was ailing. What kind of impression would that have left our children? The city of light before dark. In its place, they were getting a city of cheap steaks, chocolate eclairs for breakfast, and big screen World Cup matches. Dad's Paris. On the train, Ethan shared the football magazine with his sister, a varsity forward on her high school soccer team. My one promise about the overnight trip to Giverny had been to find a big screen in a public place so we could watch France play its opening match in the company of a cheering home crowd. We had sprinted giddily through the Louvre, but lingered in some of the other art museums. I'd cribbed for the trip with Sally's college textbook, a fraying hardcover with her round schoolgirl signature inside the cover. In a passage about Renoir, she had circled the phrase joie de vivre. Scraping together the provisional expertise of a journalist, I skimmed this text and several biographies, reading that Monet was about light and color, not muzzy edges. Quote, "It's terrible how the light runs out, taking color with it," he told an art dealer. "Color, any color, lasts a second, sometimes 3 or 4 minutes at most. What to do, what to paint in 3 or 4 minutes? They're gone. You have to stop. Ah, how I suffer. How painting makes me suffer. It tortures me, the pain it causes me." There were times working our way through the Musée d'Orsay where I could see it myself, how even the transient light of midday, a moment you hardly notice through a rustle of curtains, returns years later as a memory. A Monet painting of a snowy fence brought back long days of melting sunlight at the end of our first winter in the Alaska cabin. Sally, big-bellied in the weeks before Emily's birth, on her way to the spring box for water, had wobbled off the hard-packed trail and listed sideways into deep corn snow. She reached for my arm and said, "Oops," and smiled with a plaintive tilt of her eyebrows. It was a look she could still summon years later, on the morning of her final acupuncture appointment, after she had querulously refused help getting from the car. Thin and weak, how many more downward notches were on this volume knob? She shuffled the few steps along the gravel path, stumbled, caught herself at the door, and glanced back with the same joking look in her eyes. The railway out of Paris finally opened into wooded hills and farm fields. At the busy commercial town of Vernon, we transferred into an air-conditioned shuttle bus to cross the Seine. Monet's moody subject was glassy and black, empty of the scattered reflections that set his landscapes shimmering. Ethan pointed out a jump for wakeboarders. Giverny, a small village of brick homes and flower trellises and some 300 people, sees 500,000 tourists every year. As the day trippers on our bus made straight for the walled gardens, we clattered our bags to the inn. A night at the auberge had been part of the trip Sally planned under our Christmas tree. Our second floor room had flowers in a painted window box and a view across the road toward Poplar Woods. Emily was delighted to have a bed in her own alcove. Mom would have insisted on staying here longer, she declared, bouncing on the mattress. Ethan appeared less enthralled. A glance down the quiet ivy lane had revealed that Giverny was not the sort of place one might expect to find a sports bar with a big screen TV. The country village did seem just the sort of place, on the other hand, where a melancholy family might find salutary lessons in nature, rebirth, and the consolations of art. I thought I had a better idea, though, and led my children to a graveyard. A 45-minute taxi ride across a river-bottom farmscape brought us to the town of Vitoy. Perched above an oxbow of the Seine, Vitoy looked bigger and less precious than Giverny, with narrow sidewalks and cars whipping down cobbled streets and an air of indifference toward visitors. We bought ice cream, then walked down a road, leaving town to a small mustard-colored house where Monet lived before moving to Giverny. The years in Vitoy were the hardest of his life. A plaque on the house said it was here that Monet's wife, Camille Doncieux, died on 5 September 1879. After finding that cancer bookmark of Sally's, I had started searching the biography indexes for Vitoy, my curiosity about Camille soon outstripping interest in the artist himself. There wasn't a lot to learn. Monet's highborn second wife, Alice, who reigned over the happy years at Giverny, received most of the historian's attention, due in part to her own jealous pruning of early letters and photos. Camille had been a working-class girl and was described vaguely as tall and pretty, with a model's full figure, light-hearted and warm and tolerant of the priority her husband gave his art. She was 18 when they met in Paris, fresh from the country and 7 years younger than her student lover. For a decade, they lived in deepening poverty, their civil marriage a secret from his family, moving through towns along the lower Seine in search of fresh scenery and cheaper rents. She appeared, by one count, on at least 56 canvases, as well as in works by their friends Renoir and Manet. In the first pictures in which she appears, she's easily recognizable by the lick of hair that hangs down over her cheek, wrote Monet's cataloger. The Lady in the Green Dress, 1866, one of his first modest successes, shows her as somber. A decade later, in his hammy Japanese Woman, she's sparkling and blonde. The young woman in the paintings is an assemblage of wistful features and shifting moods, often pensively oblivious to the color all around her. The soft focus, I supposed, was a hazard of being the model for an impressionist, a subject of secondary importance. Vitoy, where the Monets moved after the birth of their second son, was the most affordable town yet. The artist described the area as ravishing. We drifted in the heat to a grassy park by the river where Emily and Ethan made their way to the muddy bank. A swan paddled a V-line toward them, invoking our new family storyline in which any solitary animal in the wild might fill suddenly with the spirit of their vigilant, nature-defending mother. While they conversed with the swan, I looked back up toward Monet's house and tried to fix the location of a masterpiece from those hard years, the artist's garden at Vitoy, which showed children descending steps through golden sunflowers and mottled blue shadows toward the Seine, perhaps to engage a swan of their own. Biographers disagree about whether Monet deleted signs of modernity from his scenes, or whether even to suggest such a thing was to miss what's essential about the artist's unflinching effort to record light as it fell on the what is. In any event, the artist's garden was no longer there. A new house had interposed itself, and a road, undetectable in the paintings, was clearly visible. I called Emily and Ethan away from the water, and we hiked up from the floodplain through heavy humidity. Amber clouds were building picturesquely over the hills. Behind the quiet main street rose the 13th century bell tower of a Romanesque church, which juts above the town like a fortress in Monet's paintings. Though indifferent to religion, he would row across the Seine to capture the village profile above the sky-dimpled river. In Vitoy, he was often gone from home, perfecting his open-air style, chasing weather and moody light obsessively, but also desperately. Camille was ill and growing worse. At times, he could not even afford pain medicine. He had help, fortunately, though it would drive the gossips wild. Alice Hochet, the wife of a bankrupt patron of Monet's, had moved to Vitoy with her 6 children to save money and help care for Camille. After the deaths of their spouses, Alice and Monet would marry, and the timeline of their evolving attachment remains unclear. Much about these painful years is simply lost, including the precise diagnosis of Camille's fatal, long-standing disease of the womb. Recent writing had settled on cancer, perhaps cervical or uterine, if not ovarian, whose tumors would have spread painfully through her abdomen, accompanied by swelling fluids and a steady creeping gauntness, a squeezing of skeletal fingers. One of Alice's daughters recalled Camille gently stroking the girl's hair, lying on a chaise lounge outdoors by the road where she could watch her sons play. The poor woman suffered greatly. Her death was long and horrible, and she was conscious until the last minute, Alice wrote in a letter. It was heartrending to see her bid a sad farewell to her children. Her long illness had not prepared Monet. On the day Camille died, he wrote, "I'm shocked to find myself alone with 2 children." A loud cracking roll of thunder surprised us as we climbed the stone steps toward the Notre Dame de Vitoy. Big gobs of rain smacked the dust in the church courtyard. The sky above remained blue and hazy with heat, but a torrent opened from someplace unseen, and we broke into a run. I thought it might be nicely on the nose to find shelter in an old world church, but the iron gate was padlocked. We pressed our backs to the wall beneath a shallow arch to avoid the slashing rain. Then we dashed to a leafy tree nearby and waited there until the cloud burst past. A steep lane, spilling with runoff, led up to the gate of a small cemetery. The air was suddenly cooler. The long string of stifling, sultry days, it turned out, was broken that afternoon by the passing line of thunderclouds. We made our way to a far corner, looking out at the river valley. A wrought iron cross waited inside a wet and glistening black metal railing. The enclosure was filled with some sort of elegant shrub studded with tiny pink flowers. We stood there quietly. I'm not exactly sure why I wanted to come here, I began. I waited for my next sentence to appear. We have no place like this for Sally, I thought. No graveside where we could go to remember and reflect. No pretty flowers to care for. When the time came, we had flown to a favorite camping spot at an alpine lake and scattered Sally's ashes in a waterfall. Given all her conservation work and our prayer flag pantheism, it seemed right to say goodbye in Alaska's wilderness. Now I wondered if it would have been better to leave her somewhere rather than everywhere. I was tongue-tied by my misgivings and the realization that this pilgrimage was probably teaching our children more about their father than their mother. Emily stirred in the silence. Mom would have liked coming here, she said generously. She wasn't a big one for slabs of marble, I said. She would have liked the pink flowers, Emily said. Camille Doncieux, wife of Claude Monet, said a faded marker. Though their marriage was consecrated on her deathbed by a priest, in this churchyard she kept the name of the working class mistress. Maintenance of her grave was neglected in Monet's time, I'd learned, and not restored until a later Impressionist revival. Monet had moved on. Giverny was his second chance, his happy ending. Remarried, rich and famous, and working harder than ever, adored by children and stepchildren, he had sculpted his placid surroundings according to his own large-scale aesthetic ideal. But he had suffered to get there, that much I understood. Camille's body lay in state for 2 days. Early in the morning of the second day, Monet had become absorbed by the play of light and color on her face. He got out his easel and produced a canvas in which her shrouded body seems to sink into the pillows and bed sheets, the harsh gray strokes touched hopelessly by faint yellow daybreak. In a self-lacerating letter, Monet told of feeling possessed as he stared at, quote, the shades and nuances of color that death brought to her countenance. Shattered by the sight, he said he went to work reflexively, first and foremost devastated organically, automatically by the colors. Against my will, my reflexes took possession of me in an unconscious process as the everyday course of my life took over, like a draft animal working at the millstone. Pity me, my friend. When I saw a color plate of Camille Monet on her deathbed, the half-sketched face, cheeks sunken and lips drawn back in a grimace seemed a betrayal, an act of callow genius to remain behind and examine what was still alive in the space between him and his subject. At the Musée d'Orsay, I was relieved to learn the painting was hidden away in storage. It had remained privately in the family for nearly a century, until shortly before the death of their last surviving son, perhaps because it revealed more of both parents' suffering than most children would want the world to see. Monet's pain is visible as well in the bleak paintings from the winter that followed Camille's death. It was the coldest winter in local memory. The Seine froze and Monet forced himself outdoors, hot water bottles in his pockets to capture the seized up season, the dirty whites and pale greens and grays of a world where light had lost its strength. He was still at it when the river thawed and gave way violently, backing up behind ice dams and spilling over banks, drowning the lowlands like the floods that come to Alaska during breakup in spring. His pallid paintings of what newspapers were calling the debacle proved surprisingly popular. They started Monet on a run of prosperity that led him to Giverny, where the ice floes turned to water lilies. Ethan had gone to explore among the marble tombstones, and Emily soon walked off to join him, leaving me alone by the black metal rail. I was remembering how it felt to stand on that flat rock above the Whitewater Falls. Everything that morning had seemed so dually, shiningly alive. Afterwards, I climbed away to take a photo. Emily and Ethan had been perched above the waterfall on the sunny alpine tundra. Ethan was horsing around and suddenly his treasured baseball cap had sailed into the cataract. Seized by unreasonable terror, I flew down the slope and splashed into a pool just where the river plunged over another falls and snatched back his cap before it floated into eternity. That evening, we took another long taxi ride to the railway town of Vernon, where our Portuguese driver found us a brasserie with pommes frites, a big TV screen, and the hoped-for crowd of smoking, drinking, jeering Frenchmen. We got back to Giverny with plenty of light still in the sky and walked around for a while. The village quiet now, the tour buses gone. The next morning, under high overcast, we were second in line at the garden gate. I hustled the kids downhill through blooming rows of what Monet called his tonal harmonies to the weeping willows. For 20 minutes, we had the water lily pond nearly to ourselves. Then a busload of Chinese tourists reached the Japanese bridge, and the contemplation of color and light required too much editing. Our next stop beckoned, the ruins farther down the river valley of a castle built by Richard the Lionheart. An old friend from Paris met us in the crowded gift shop, and we exited to his car through a motherlode of impressionist posters and tea towels. I had forgiven Monet the night before. It was during our quiet walk through Giverny after the France-Switzerland game. In creamy light, poplars swang in the rush of a warm breeze. We'd followed the deserted main street past shadowed gardens and half-timbered houses. At the unadorned village church, we paused briefly at the graves of Claude and Alice Monet and Alice's first husband. Emily and Ethan then headed back to the inn where they could watch Brazil in the evening's final match on a small television in the room. They walked away holding hands. Alone, I followed a random side lane uphill, past a small residential art institute, ringing with the clatter of dinner dishes and the laughter of couples. There was a bench at the road's end and a footpath wandering into woods that probably weren't there in Monet's time. The landscapes were more open back then. Evidently, today's rural population, busy commuting to Paris or selling impressionist calendars, no longer cut firewood or unleashed herds of goats to chomp back the brush. I translated roughly a sign describing an environmental restoration project that aimed to return, through selective grazing, the famous pastoral look of the chalk hills. To Alaskans steeped in environmental impact statements, these old world landscapes seemed so carefully husbanded. Monet's plan to tap a local tributary for his Japanese pond had in fact been opposed at first by local farmers on the grounds that exotic plants might poison cattle downstream. Later, though, he became a local hero for contributing funds to prevent construction of a factory. Even Monet, the painter of light falling on the what is, worked hard in Giverny to control the tonal harmonies of his happy ending. Sally, the conservationist, would surely have applauded his efforts. But Sally, the cancer patient, might have had a different perspective. I recalled an evening toward the end when her house was filled with her family, flown north to say goodbye. Ethan came home from a fishing trip that day with his first ever king salmon. I lit the charcoal, but was distracted by so many small household emergencies that the coals burned out before I could grill the fish. In the moment, it seemed such a tragedy. His first king salmon. And in the bedroom, my wife was dying. I went to Sally in tears, and she consoled me, her manner loving but already distant. Control is a distraction from what is really going on, she said. I felt an urge there in the woods above Giverny to ask what Sally thought about the effort to control the appearance of the chalk hills. And I found myself clinging gratefully to the sensation. At one time, I'd started many such magical conversations about politics or parenting dilemmas. These always ended abruptly as I registered her absence anew. My life had been rich with grief. Now, the impulse to turn and address her lingering presence came rarely. In the same way, items from our life rediscovered, a misshapen red sweater on a back shelf, a trove of confidential mom notes in Emily's grade school hand, had the power to burn like a wound. Uncovered and examined, their power faded. My landscape, by and large, was cleared of the dangers of such detonations. The terrible drama of life without Sally was mostly over. Pity me, my friend. I missed it. I don't know exactly how long I loitered there on the bench, lost in the fading glow of her schoolgirl joie de vivre, imagining the tonal harmonies of the future we'd planned. Then I saw the dusk was closing in. I let go and started down the hill, eager to rejoin my children before the game was over. The thing we're moving toward, after all, is of secondary importance. It is the light in between that tells us we're still alive. Thank you.